For most of my life, I've worked with people who've been classed as at risk, highly vulnerable, and on the margins of society. I've worked with out-of-school youth, people with disabilities, prisoners, ex-prisoners, and their families. But I was totally unprepared for the children of northern Uganda. Over the course of 25 years, Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, commonly known as the LRA, had terrorized this region of East Africa and abducted over 30,000 children for use as child soldiers and sex slaves. By the mid-2000s, thousands of abducted kids were escaping and returning home, only to find themselves stigmatized and shut out. In a way, these youth seemed doubly cursed. They suffered mightily at the hands of the rebels and were forced to do unspeakable things. And when they returned, they were blamed for it. This issue of reintegration was an escalating problem with few answers. Based on my prior work, I was invited to come and explore some possible solutions. So late on a hot and dusty afternoon in March of 2006, my son and I pulled into Gulu, the largest town in northern Uganda. Dodging hundreds of kids with mats and blankets on their heads who were heading into town to sleep on the streets, and military and UN vehicles everywhere you looked, I was stunned by the sights, sounds, and smells of war. As dusk turned into evening, the countryside went eerily dark, and we began to hear sporadic gunfire, which continued throughout the night. I laid awake most of that first night, overwhelmed and wondering what in the heck I was doing here, and was there anything that I could possibly do. During a visit to one of the displacement camps, I met a girl named Grace. Sitting alone in the corner of a grass-thatched shelter out of the heat of the sun, she was a thin, shabbily dressed girl who appeared to me to be about 17. Playing in the dirt at her feet was her little boy, Christopher. Over the next several hours, Grace told me her story through a translator. On the rare occasion when she would lift her eyes and look at me, she had this haunted look that mirrored the pain in her words. She was abducted at the age of 10 by the LRA, strung together with other abducted children by ropes around their necks. They were forced to carry heavy loads of stolen supplies. Driven by their abductors, they were forced through the bush for days on end to the training fields of the LRA in South Sudan. Terrified, thirsty, and hungry, Grace found life in the LRA camps to be even worse. Run by brutal commanders, most of whom were no older than she was trained as a child soldier and was quickly pushed to the front lines of the marauding force that was terrorizing northern Uganda and South Sudan. Often without enough food and water to eat, the kids ate roots and dirt and drank their own urine. If they cried out or tried to escape, they were beaten and often killed. But as bad as Grace's reality was during the day, and during the night was even worse. Given to a senior commander as a sex slave shortly after she was abducted, she was sexually abused and raped night after night. As months stretched into years, she prayed to God that she would someday be reunited with her family. 6 years later, in the confusion and chaos of a firefight with government troops, she finally found the time and place to escape. Now alone, scared, and 8 months pregnant, Grace had to hide from both the rebels and the government troops as she found a way to get back through the bush to northern Uganda. When she reached Gulu, she found that her parents had been killed by the rebels. Her sisters and brothers had been split up and were gone. Despondent and alone, she hooked up with a man who already had a couple of wives. And it wasn't long before she was beaten and abused by these women because of her past Angry, disillusioned, and now pregnant again, she fled and began to live on her own, trying as best she could to raise her son, who was abused also because he was the son of a rebel. Despite her resiliency and the aid that she now received in the displacement camps, I could see that her anger and bitterness was consuming her, not only towards the rebels, but equally towards her family and the other people in the camps. More than consuming her, it was blocking her recovery. She had every right to be bitter, but she wasn't able to move on. My experience with Grace and hundreds of others with similar stories caused me to think deeply about the concept of forgiveness and the role that it could play in their healing from the trauma that they had experienced. We opened Child Voice in 2007, and forgiveness became a core element in our model for a long-term therapeutic program for highly traumatized, war-affected girls. To understand the transformative role forgiveness can play, listen carefully to what James Kony, who works for Child Voice, what he had to say about Joseph Kony when he was interviewed for a documentary called Forgive Me, Mother.
Well, the government should go slowly to talk with Kony, slowly, to convince Kony and other people who are still there in Congo to come back home, so we join our hand to develop our land. But if Kony is still there in the bush, can decide and come and destroy everything one day. Yes, they were supported before, but when they start killing people, their own people realize that, no, we are supporting something different. This is not a government. And they are not going to take over the government. I'm James saying I can forgive Kony. Maybe somebody say, no, I cannot. But we cannot sleep normally if he's still in the bush. Because when you don't get satisfied thinking about your brother, I'm now satisfied, what about him? Oh, I'm now okay, what about him? We can forgive Kony and all the commanders if he really accept to come back home with all our children who are suffering in the bush. And no finger pointing that you were killing us and now you are back at home.
Now let me add some context to what James has just said. Like Grace, James was also abducted by the LRA along with his younger sister. Both of them eventually escaped and returned home to their village of Lakoti. James married a woman from the village, and they had 6 children together. During the war, he and his family were forced into the Lakoti displacement camp, and over the next several years, 5 of their 6 children died from disease in those crowded and unsanitary conditions. James and his wife were still living in that camp in April of 2004 when a group of LRA rebels swept in, surrounded the camp, and set fire to the thatched roofs. Hundreds were killed or maimed, and a large number of children were abducted that day. It is still known as the war's worst single-day massacre. But for James and his wife, it was the final straw. Now they had lost everything. So how is it that someone like James, who has suffered so much and lost so much at the hands of Kony and the LRA, come to the place where he's willing to forgive Kony and is asking him to come home? James' ability to forgive may seem surprising, but it is rooted in the traditional restorative justice process called matu oput that is deeply ingrained in the culture of the Acholi people of northern Uganda. This ceremony ends with the offender stepping on an egg symbolizing a return to innocence, and then crossing over a line, after which he or she is accepted back into the community. The acceptance is so complete that if anyone in the community accuses that person of wrongdoing again, it's the accuser who will be tried for offending the community. Does this really work? I certainly don't think there's any magic in the elements of the ceremony. But the strength of this restorative justice practice is in the process of forgiveness. Today in northern Uganda, there are thousands of former rebels who have been reintegrated into civil society through the Amnesty Act and at the community level through ceremonies like Matua Put. In fact, the Acholi leaders of northern Uganda have protested against the International Criminal Court indictments of Joseph Kony and his top commanders. They have begged the international community to allow them to handle justice in their traditional way, and in so doing bring an end to the longest war in Africa. To date, their pleas have sadly gone unanswered, and the war continues. Could something like this work in the West? In the late 90s, I was part of a team at Prison Fellowship who designed the Interchange Freedom Initiative in Texas, the first faith-based prison in the U.S. Ron Flowers was one of the inmates I selected for that program's first class. Ron had been in prison for 14 years and was completing a sentence for the second-degree murder of D.D. Washington, an innocent bystander in a drug deal gone bad. One of the core elements of the Interchange program is the application of restorative justice principles. One way we did this was to confront offenders with the harm they had done to their victims. During one of these sessions, Ron finally admitted that he did in fact commit the murder of Dee Dee. Overwhelmed by his admission, he began to pray that her family would forgive him. He finally wrote a letter to her mother, Anna Washington, expressing his remorse and asking her for forgiveness. As you might guess, Anna was shocked by his letter, but she agreed to meet with him. Take a look as Ron and Anna described this first meeting.
Ron began to tell me what took place and how he never meant to hurt my daughter. And he was so sorry.
Knowing what I have done, knowing I have took a precious life out of this world for no reason, and it was just hard for me to face her, look at her eye to eye, and I just started crying.
Tears were all over his face. I'd never seen so many tears seem to me like. They weren't just coming from his eyes, they were just coming.
We all were crying then. I think Jack Howlett, the director, myself, Mr. Washington, and Ron was crying at that time.
I never felt so warm, and I felt close to God, and I felt like I heard my daughter's voice say, "Forgive him, Mom." And then I said, in fact, I'll go one step further. I said, I could even be your other mom.
And then, man, that just really, just really, I can't describe the words. I just can't describe it, but I mean, it took a hold to me, man.
Several months later, at Ron's graduation from the program, Anna hugged him as he came across the stage, and then she turned to tell the audience, "This is my adopted son." Through this amazing act of forgiveness, 2 lives were radically changed. Anna began to fill the void that Dee Dee had left through her relationship with Ron after he got out of prison. In turn, she became the mom that Ron had never had growing up. Now, 18 years later, Ron has a successful career driving a truck. Although Anna recently died, Ron has kept her memory alive by naming his granddaughter after her. You see, without forgiveness, there can really be no reconciliation, no ability to move on. Lasting reconciliation, as seen in this transaction between Ron and Anna, involves the request for forgiveness by one and the extension of forgiveness by the other. Restorative justice has a redeeming effect for both the victim and the offender, a result that is unattainable when justice is understood as only retribution against the offender through our courts. There's nothing redeeming about that kind of justice, and in truth, nobody wins in the end. But reconciliation is not always possible. As a child soldier, Grace didn't know her victims or the families of those that she had killed. She had no one to ask forgiveness, and yet she was paralyzed by the nightmares and the guilt for what she had done. Further, it was not likely that Kony or those that had hurt her would ever ask for forgiveness. Yet I believe that it had to come from within to forgive herself and to forgive those who had hurt her. Forgiveness was at the heart of the transformation and healing that she desperately needed. After months at Child Voices Center, Grace finally accepted that it was God who could forgive her for the evil that she had committed while in the LRA. As the guilt began to dissipate through experiencing her own forgiveness, she found that she could begin to forgive those who had hurt her so deeply and had stolen her childhood. I happened to be at the program shortly before Grace's class graduated, and I sat with the girls one night, and I asked them what this experience had meant to them. Grace was the first one to her feet and began to talk about the changes within her. She recalled how incorrigible she had been and how grateful she was that she had not been kicked out like she had been in other programs. And then she spoke about the importance of her faith and how things had turned when she was able to accept the forgiveness from God for what she had done. Unmerited, but freely given. In Christianity, this is known as grace. That freedom allowed her to forgive those who had hurt her so deeply. So what can we learn from these stories of transformation? Think about it. If James could forgive Kony, and if Anna could forgive Ron, and if Grace could forgive those who had ripped away her innocence in childhood, then maybe there's hope for all of us who find ourselves seeking justice. The restoration of relationships and community seem to be a far better outcome of justice if we are really serious about making our world a better and a safer place for our kids and our families. Thank you.